Um, it falls to me to begin today a conversation about the philosophy of Arthur Schopenhauer. I do so with difficulty and diffidence because Schopenhauer's ideas are the inverse of my moral and political beliefs, and my metaphysical beliefs also. But I'll try. Rather than beginning directly by addressing any of Schopenhauer's doctrines, I begin by reading a passage from a political pamphlet published in 1819 by the English poet William Wordsworth. This pamphlet was a denunciation by Wordsworth of the English government for having settled with Napoleon by the Convention of Sintra, the title of this pamphlet, and having thus betrayed its Portuguese allies who were waging against Napoleon's armies a war of national resistance and liberation. And toward the end of this long pamphlet, Wordsworth pauses to consider the sorrows of human existence. And this is what he says. But it is a belief propagated in books and which passes currently among talking men as part of their familiar wisdom, that the hearts of the many are constitutionally weak, that they do languish and are slow to answer to the requisitions of things. I entreat those who are in this delusion to look behind them and about them for the evidence of experience. Now this, rightly understood, not only gives no support to any such belief, but proves that the truth is in direct opposition to it. The history of all ages, tumults after tumults, wars, foreign or civil, with short or with no breathing spaces, from generation to generation. Wars, why and wherefore? Yet with courage, with self-sacrifice, with enthusiasm, with cruelty driving forward the cruel man from its own terrible nakedness, and attracting the more benign by the accompaniment of some shadow which seems to sanctify it. The senseless weaving and interweaving of factions, vanishing and reviving and piercing each other like the northern lights. Public commotions and those in the bosom of the individual. The long calenture to which the lover is subject. The blast, like the blast of the desert, which sweeps perennially through a frightful solitude of its own making in the mind of the gamester. The slowly quickening but even quickening descent of appetite down which the miser is propelled, the agony and cleaving oppression of grief, the ghost-like hauntings of shame, the incubus of revenge, the life distemper of ambition. These inward existences and the visible and familiar occurrences of daily life in every town and village, the patient curiosity and contagious acclamations of the multitude in the streets of the city and within the walls of the theater, a procession or a rural dance, a hunting or a horse race, a flood or a fire, rejoicing and ringing of bells for the unexpected gift of good fortune, or the coming of a foolish heir to his estate. These demonstrate incontestably that the passions of men I mean the soul of sensibility in the heart of man, in all quarrels, in all contests, in all delights, and in all employments, which are either sought by men or thrust upon them, do immeasurably transcend their objects. The true sorrow of humanity consists in this: not that the mind of man fails, but that the course and demands of action and of life so rarely correspond with the dignity and intensity of human desires. And hence, that which is slow to languish is too easily turned aside and abused. So Wordsworth here evokes this enormous fire, this life force, this vitality that is within ordinary humanity. And the question is, what should our attitude to it be? This is, in a sense, the fundamental question presented by Schopenhauer's philosophy. Another poet, the German poet Friedrich Hölderlin, wrote, "He who thinks most deeply loves what is most alive." So one might think that this life force, this vitality, this restless seeking is the most important feature, the reminder of the attribute of our transcendence, as Wordsworth calls it in this text. And then on that view, all of our ambitions, all of our efforts should be turned to preserve this life force and to raise it up, to refine it, to equip it so that it can be more fertile. From that standpoint, the tragedy of the contemporary societies is that the vast preponderance of this life force is dissipated, goes up in smoke for want of opportunities and of instruments. And the ordinary man and woman goes to the grave without having had a chance to transform it into constructive action. But the alternative approach to this central force is that this life force is a delusion, that it is the source of our unhappiness, and that no good can come of the attempt to preserve and to transform it into constructive action, that we must overcome it, that we must wipe our hands clear of the entanglements that it proposes to us. Now, with this initial passage as the background, as the provocation to our discussion, let me begin by reminding you of the metaphysical background to Schopenhauer's moral ideas, his view of what the world is like. And his metaphysic is an instance, the most salient, eloquent instance in the history of Western philosophy, of the metaphysical tradition that was preponderant, for example, in ancient India. The philosophy that I call the philosophy of the timeless one. And this view can have both a radical and a qualified form. The radical view is that all the changes and distinctions in the world, including the distinctions among individual selves, are illusory. And reality is, at bottom, unified and timeless. That's the timeless one. And the source of all of our suffering, of all of our mistakes, of all of our misadventures, is to be entangled by the illusion of the reality and authority of these distinctions and these changes. We must free ourselves from these entanglements. The qualified version of this philosophy of the timeless one is that the distinctions and changes that we witness in the world are not entirely illusory, but they are of a lower order of reality. Behind them, behind these individual phenomena and their transformations, lie the enduring archetypes of reality. And there is a chain, a hierarchy of forms of being that goes from the misleading surface to the deep reality of these archetypes. And that is the view that we have in the West, for example, expressed in the middle period of the philosophy of Plato, and it has taken many other forms subsequently in the history of Western philosophy. Now, there are a series of distinctively metaphysical problems that have to do with the attempt to make sense of this view of what the world is like. And I mentioned a few of them last week in our conversation. So one problem is, why does the world present itself to us in a form that denies its true reality? Why is there this fantastic detour, as it were, in which reality conceals itself and misleads us into mistaking its distinctions and transformations for the real? And there doesn't seem to be ever any adequate explanation of this fundamental problem. But the second issue is that this view seems to give us no way of engaging reality and understanding the transformations that do appear. To understand something is always to understand what it can become. That is what insight is. Insight into the actual is parasitic on imagination of the adjacent possible. The way we understand something is to imagine what it can become, not ultimately, but at the next step under certain provocations or interventions. The imagination has two moves. One move is distancing from the phenomenon. An image is the memory of a perception. And the second move is to subsume the actual, the phenomenon, under a range of adjacent possible variations. That's how we understand it. So it seems that another problem with this view, a cognitive problem, is that it creates no hold for the imagination, no way in which the imagination can have a grip on reality. Because it says that all of this is floating or unreal or epiphenomenal in some way. Now, Samuel Beckett, the playwright, was a follower of Schopenhauer's, and he always traveled with the world and will as will and representation in his luggage. He was inseparable from it. And in one of his plays, one character says to another, "You're on Earth. There's no cure for that." But in fact, Schopenhauer believed that there was a cure. There was, or there is, a road to salvation. And before representing that road, understanding its content, let's remind ourselves of the perennial incitements in the history of thought to the way of thinking represented by Schopenhauer's philosophy. It is a permanent option, an enduring option in the history of thought. And it will reappear in one form or another, maybe forever. What is it that inspires this view that is so contrary to our immediate experience? So the first is the experience of the reality and the universality of mind. The mysterious experience of consciousness as something that is separate from the physical and that is universal. The second incitement is the transient character of everything that we encounter in the world. Everything is ephemeral. Nothing that we find in the world is forever. But of course, then there is a missing link. How do we get from the idea of the transience of everything to the idea of its unreality? Everything might be transient, but no less real on that account, as is suggested in what I call the third position in the world history of philosophy. And the third incitement to this way of thinking is the experience of insatiability, the insatiable character of our desires, the treadmill of desire, chaining us to the wheel of endless yearning, satisfaction, satiation, boredom, new yearning. It never ceases. And these three elements together help account for the hold of this view. But then, what is the road to salvation, if indeed there is a cure to being on the earth? You could say there's a minimalist ambition and a maximalist ambition. So the road to salvation is defined in some space between the minimum and the maximum. The minimum is disentanglement, the breaking of the will and of our illusions about its objects. The attachments and engagements that fascinate us. To free ourselves from all of that, that's the minimum. And the maximum is to establish contact, communion with the timeless one. And it's in that space between this minimum and that maximum that salvation must be found. Now, Schopenhauer recommended three major paths, methods, for salvation given these beliefs. The first is the development of a disinterested view of the world, cultivating those forms of understanding that are not contaminated by the will. And he thought, for example, that young children were in paradise because they had this disinterested view of reality, uncontaminated by the will, just pure curiosity, thus revealing his lack of acquaintance with young children. his and the highest forms of art, like music, are those forms in which this element of the will is suppressed, is absent. Now, the second method is asceticism, the mortification of the will, the breaking of the will, so that this desire can be suppressed. And a cardinal instance of the desire is the hold of the sexual impulse on us, which Schopenhauer saw as a cruel manipulation of humanity, which makes us serve the purposes of reproduction and then discards us, condemning us to annihilation. Like others before and after him, he knew that many who have undressed have been disappointed. So his attitude was the suppression, the breaking of the will through mortification, through asceticism. And the third and highest method was the method of holiness, which he attributed to the mystics. Which then established the communion. It was the maximalist form of salvation, established communion with the timeless one, and sustained the basis for a universal fellow feeling, reality. And then Schopenhauer has the image of what we are like. We're like the shipwrecks on a boat thrown on the sea, clinging to one another. And the basis for this universal empathy or altruism is the unreality of the distinctions among us, or indeed of any distinctions in the world. So you see then how we can place this moral view in a set of oppositions that we've discussed before in the course. So first, the contrast between happiness as privation of pain and happiness as fullness, variety, and contradiction of activity. Schopenhauer is on the first side of this divide. Then, altruism versus love. There's no space in this philosophy for personal love. So in personal love, you look to the other and you say, do you love me? There's no such anxious questioning that would be authorized by Schopenhauer's philosophy. And finally, the contrast between staying out of trouble and looking for trouble. The acceptance and the rejection of vulnerability. Schopenhauer's philosophy is definitely on the side of our disentanglement, of staying out of trouble. And if we do all of this that he recommends, this breaking of the will, this overcoming of the world and its illusions, what will we have in the end? We will have nothing at the core of reality, but this nothing will be everything. And our lives will be filled by a radiance, a great light, which will give us the eternal now. Such is the promise of the sublime philosophy of Arthur Schopenhauer.
So thank you so much. What I would like to do, very much building on Professor Unger's arguments, is to lay out the implications for us of what Schopenhauer is doing. And to lay the basis for this, let me begin with some grand statements. So as we have noted, we are beginning in this course temporally with these extraordinary periods, beginning midway through the first millennium BCE and continuing over that next millennium, when you get these radical, incredibly counterintuitive views that were attempts to utterly transform the world, overthrow existing religious practices, existing philosophical conceptions, if that's even the word to use, and radically rethink everything. We then noted how these came to be domesticated over that subsequent millennium. And then we noted part of the question for us is it possible to retrieve these ideas, possibly secularizing and naturalizing them, and yet maintaining their extraordinary power, perhaps even building on that extraordinary power through that act of naturalization? Now, I introduce this to make the following sets of points. First of all, with Christianity, we have noted the dangers of the ways that attempted secularization occurred in the 19th century. And let me say a few more words about that, and then I will turn to Schopenhauer as another attempt in the 19th century to secularize many of these ideas that we were looking at last week. So to begin with Christianity, as we've noted a few times, the 19th century version of the secularization of Christianity involved a series of claims about essentially humans becoming divine. And very briefly, to mention two names that have come up a couple of times, with Kant, the version of this, extraordinarily influential on subsequent Western thought, was to say, the world of our experience is in fact given to the world by humans. There is theoretically the thing in itself, the world as such. That world is unknowable to us. Who knows what it is? It's irrelevant. However, the world of our experience, if we experience it properly, is a world of causality, of rational space and time. That world is given by humans. It is the human mind that represents the world in terms of rational actions, causality, space and time, that gives it the basis for making the ethical decisions that we were discussing at the very beginning of this course. Now, that does not mean to say we automatically do this. For Kant, the key was we needed to become educated to train ourselves to be able to be rational lawgivers. Once we do so, however, there is a rational structure to everything, not in the world itself, but given by humans, and any human who is so educated will be part of that, and that world is the proper world in which we humans should live. In essence, we become the gods, giving to the world rationality. Now, that's putting it slightly stronger than Kant would have. However, his subsequent figure, building out of his ideas, Hegel, has no problem going there, and in fact, if anything, ramps up the implications. Hegel's view, we touched on this very briefly, but again, very telling about conceptions since then, is yes, it's not just that humans are divine, it is, if anything, more so. So Hegel will work all of this out in terms of a grand teleology, and it is humans over the course of its entire history that undertake the work required to become the absolute spirit that fully and completely gives order to the world. There is one rational order to the world. Once that has been achieved, and Hegel thought it was being achieved in Europe in the early 19th century, and specifically by himself, once that is achieved, it is the final teleological endpoint of all of humanity. But again, as you'll note immediately, it isn't really just all of humanity. For Hegel, this is the final endpoint of everything. The entire cosmos requires humans to do this. That is what gives the world its purely rational structure. There is a rational structure. It will be agreed upon by every single human who properly understands how the world operates, and humanity excuse me, has now achieved this. And as we have noted, much lesser versions of that view became very predominant in various forms of 19th century thought. On the one hand, radical claims of self-assertion, in which humans become the divine, and then the question is an endless one of, do individuals, through their self-assertion, become divine, in which case, how do they adjudicate their claims? Or is there an inherent view, Kant and Hegel would say yes, that all rational humans would absolutely and automatically accept? And hence, as we noted in academic philosophy, much reduced, you get the endless debates. Is there an absolute rational sense that everyone will come to accept? Do you have individual views that need to be adjudicated through consequentialist or consensus forms, etc.? All of these, as we've noted, are secularizations of earlier Christian ideas, and as we've noted, at least in our opinion, not terribly successful attempts to do so. And hence, as we noted, Professor Unger's work of saying, how could we do this differently to develop a naturalized vision of what's really going on in Christianity that could bring out its power in ways that the 19th century, in many ways, lost. All of this is an introduction to today's discussion. So, Schopenhauer is, in a sense, trying to do the same, as Professor Unger has mentioned, with earlier Indian thought, in part Buddhism, but in many ways much more so, as Professor Unger has mentioned, the Upanishads, that we also looked at very, very briefly last week. And he is doing so, of course, in explicit opposition to everything I just mentioned. Hegel, in fact, is one of his biggest antagonists. Going that way, Schopenhauer hated Hegel. Hegel didn't care much about Schopenhauer, but Schopenhauer hated Hegel. And you can imagine precisely why. Very briefly, Schopenhauer's move here is to say, yes, so when Hegel says it is the force of the will, of the absolute spirit, that imposes a rational order on absolutely everything, and its final realization is the final fulfillment of the absolute spirit, and therefore the final realization of the entire cosmos, Schopenhauer's flip side of that is to say, yes, absolutely true, in the sense that the world of our experience is a representation by humans. Humans represent that world through an act of the will. That act of the will is, in fact, the world that we therefore experience. However, that act of the will, oh, and I should even say, he even goes the next step and says, were this to be done fully, we would realize the will that we have individually is, in fact, the will that exists in the entire world, exactly as Hegel will do. However, Schopenhauer's move here is to say, in fact, that will is not one of radical self-assertion, as Hegel would claim. That will, on the contrary, is amoral. It is not good. It is not evil. It is not rational. It is none of those things. And in fact, were we to gain a sense of what it is, we would realize that what we think of as the will as self-assertion, is in fact a horribly dangerous debasement of that, because what happens is when we see the world in terms of the individual will, what we are doing is taking the world as will, taking it to the individual level, and once it's at the individual level, it becomes nothing but simple self-assertion of an endless war of every individual against every individual, a world of endless striving that's always doomed, endless war that by definition creates incredible destruction, and therefore endless suffering. And what you are doing, therefore, when, as Professor Unger has mentioned, you were learning to renounce the will, the individual will as self-assertion, you are actually getting closer to the will of the world, but that will of the world is, again, not one of self-assertion at all. And therefore, you are renouncing the world, you are renouncing the will is self-assertion, and that is done through, as Professor Unger has mentioned, things like practices that will allow you to conquer the will, things like music, which he thinks will give you the tranquility of sensing the rest of the world as will, but will as oneness, not will as individual self-assertion. And all of this is a radical rejection of the entire notion of the individual will. It is, in other words, a form of a naturalization of the very ideas we were discussing last week. But I would like to mention there are dangers in the way that Schopenhauer has done it, just as there are dangers in the ways that 19th century European thinkers also were trying to secularize Christianity. And let me lay out a few of these, and beginning with one of the most significant. One of the key issues we mentioned last week that motivates the entire Buddhist tradition is this incredible tension between, on the one hand, the call to indeed renounce the world and renounce the will, but as we noted, this term, renounce the world, must be understood in a very specific sense. You are coming to understand the world of our experience as, in fact, a product of our will being inherently enmeshed in our desires. You are trying to conquer the self, conquer the desires that create this willed world, and therefore reject the world that has been constructed through essentially our desires, but our desires now made as the will of self-assertion. That is true. But as we also noted, part of the power of Buddhism is it takes out any, and I'll use this, I don't mean to be unfair to Schopenhauer, but I'll come back to why I'm going to use this word. It takes out an easy response to this, because the move of Buddhism is to say that work of renouncing the will and overcoming the self is something that is extraordinarily difficult to do. And in fact, you will spend, if you devote yourself to it, the next eons and eons and eons and eons of rebirths striving to do it. The flip side of that meaning that because you will not be succeeding, every single thing you are doing at every single moment when you are not renouncing the will, which means everything we will do until eons and eons hence, everything you are doing is immediately creating suffering around you, often in ways that you are failing to realize because you are not seeing what you are really doing. And the implications of that will create this bad karma that will continue for lifetimes. It is not just that you are creating suffering that will continue while you are on the planet, it will continue for eons and eons and eons. So it's this radical push on trying to get people to be incredibly self-conscious about everything they are doing in this world that we have constructed, precisely because that world will continue for eons, and hence the powerful tension. The work is one of constantly trying to push against our desires as will that have created this illusory world, and yet, because it pushes so strongly that you're not going to succeed in this for eons, the flip side of that is this incredible focus on every single moment. What am I doing? What kind of suffering am I causing? How do I work against that? Which, of course, in Buddhism is seen as the work of compassion, right? It's the endless work of compassion. The Buddha is a figure of pure compassion. We are not there, to say the least, and will not be for eons if we ever achieve it. But what we will strive to do is become ever more compassionate by constantly striving to see what we are doing. And hence, the push of Buddhism, as we mentioned last week, is not one of let's simply not do anything. It's rather this incredible push toward strong forms of activism, but again, in these very specific forms. We noted the way Gandhi will do it. So activism to try to force those around him, in this case the British, to see what it is they are doing. those incredible images of people setting themselves on fire, but as a protest to say, look at what you are doing. It's action forcing others to realize the suffering they are causing when they are living in illusory worlds, failing to see the suffering that they are actually doing. I say all of this because, of course, Schopenhauer has no interest in rebirth. He has no interest in karma. And you may not either. That's not my point yet, although we'll come back to that. But my point is, when you simply take that out without doing anything to build back in that other side of the tension, the danger is you get exactly what Professor Unger was laying out, and I think very, very correctly so. With Schopenhauer, you get none of that other side of the motivating power of Buddhism. In Schopenhauer, it really is, you do the equivalence of, you tame your desires, you listen to music, you try to become tranquil. It's a world renunciation in a much more literal and immediate sense because you don't have that flip tension. It's not that you know that you're going to fail and you will live with the implications, or rather those that you affect badly will live with the implications for eons, and therefore this incredible heightened focus on everything you're doing all the time. The danger of a Schopenhauerian position, taken to its extreme, which at various times in his life he does take to its extreme, is renunciation in a very literal sense. You cease striving in a very literal sense. You conquer the will, and that's it. But no, Buddhism takes out that easy option. You don't conquer the will. You try to, and you'll spend eons trying to, but you're going to fail, which builds in that tension that makes it work. Now, this raises the question I alluded to before, but then let's turn to it directly. You may plausibly say, okay, but then what if we, for example, don't believe in karma and don't believe in rebirths? Is there a way to take seriously these ideas without becoming a Schopenhauer? I don't have an easy answer, but what I would like to suggest is at least possibly. Because note, even in the Buddhist tradition, the notion of karma and rebirths plays out in very different ways in different cultural contexts. In some places, it's not even terribly significant. So can you have a concern with these issues that would also build in the other side of the tension? In other words, a focus on trying to actively work against the suffering being created in the world, striving to sense what to do in specific situations to break people's actions that are creating suffering? Could you build all of that in with a theory of breaking the self and breaking the will that would not lead to the easy way out of simply saying, let's become tranquil, let's become, as Professor Unger has correctly said, just try to stay out of trouble. Something that you don't see strongly in the Buddhist tradition, but I think in Schopenhauer is absolutely going on.
So I think, Michael,
just let me quickly quote. And so I think this, to us, is one of the key questions. Can we do what Professor Unger is doing to the secularization of Christianity? Could we do the same with Buddhism and say, if we're not convinced by the way Schopenhauer has done it, could we reinvigorate the power of that Buddhist move without turning to the kinds of easy staying out of trouble, easy is a mean word, but that form of staying out of trouble that I think you see in Schopenhauer. Yeah, sorry.
So I think it would be helpful to ask, what is the sign in moral consciousness, in our experience of life and of ourselves, that we have succeeded in traveling on this road to salvation? And it seems to me that the sign in Schopenhauer is the combination of serenity with benevolence. So you can say, what is the basis of serenity? How and why do we become serene? It's because the will is being undermined on both sides. That is, the seat of the will in the individual self is being undermined and denied. There are no individual selves, ultimately. In a sense, death is an illusion because we were never really alive as distinct individual selves. And second, because the target of the will, the object of the will, are our engagements and our attachments or connections. And those two are denied. So the will is being denied from both these sides. And once we are connected and engaged, once we formulate tasks and develop attachments, we're in trouble. That's the idea. Because then we embark on the adventures and misadventures that are inherent in having tasks and having attachments. The attachments may fail. In our tasks, we may be defeated and so forth. So that's the basis of serenity. And then what is the kind of benevolence that is compatible with that radical serenity? It is a cold benevolence. It is a benevolence from a distance in which we recognize our unity, which has a metaphysical basis, but there's no question of the other person, the particular other, you and me, the dialectic of personal encounter. So this is, in a way, an inhuman benevolence, because it is a benevolence from the distance, from the perspective of the stars. And that's the benevolence that is recommended to us as the counterpart, as the partner for this willness serenity. Not stating the idea in its most extreme form, but I think it's correct because it brings out the moral consequences of this metaphysic. And obviously incompatible with Christianity. How could one recommend serenity to a Christian if the Redeemer died on the cross? And so forth. So it's a radically different idea. And it leads to a different conception of the benevolence to which we should aspire, which is nothing like personal love and its complications.
Yes, although let me say again, I think that's a perfect explanation of Schopenhauer. In Buddhism, ultimately, it's an accurate summary of where you're going, but the key is we're not going to get there. So let me give a very concrete example that I alluded to last week. So when Gandhi, who's not exclusively a Buddhist, but he's coming out of the Buddhist tradition, so when he is training people to walk in front of British soldiers and be beaten without fighting back. Now, I mean, think of this. I mean, you can't hit back. I mean, they're literally beating you, possibly to death. You cannot fight back. Now, is that an inhuman overcoming of the will? Absolutely. Absolutely. And inhuman to the point where Gandhi would frequently have to stop the protest because he said, we're not ready to do this yet. Because
no, but there's something else there, right? Which is the idea that there is a fateful, decisive task, and that the task requires the sacrifice of the individual.
Precisely.
That's another set of ideas.
But the reason you're doing this, of course, is obviously for us, if we're the ones marching forward, we're trying to conquer ourselves. But the reason you're trying to do it is you're trying to end the suffering by having them, in this case the British, see what it is they are doing. So the British may think we are liberating the world by overcoming superstition and bringing people into the rational world of the British. And the move is to say, we are going to force you to see what you are really doing by forcing people in London to open up a newspaper and see pictures of what's really going on. Now, the reason I give that example is this isn't a serenity of, well, the world is just violent and I'll listen to music and be tranquil because there will always be suffering. The push, on the contrary, is we can't take that option because we're not going to be leaving this world for eons. So the focus is, therefore, every instant, what do we do to try to ease this suffering? And that involves incredible activity in the world. Now, it's a radically different activity, absolutely, I agree, with the kinds of pushes you're getting out of Christianity. But I think that, to me, is one of the philosophical challenges of the tradition.
So there's one more thing I want to add. So I emphasize this duo of serenity and benevolence as the characteristic moral affect that is associated with Schopenhauer's view. But there's another affect which deserves emphasis, and which I came to at the end of my remarks. And that's this idea that the eternal, the eternal nothing or the eternal everything is not something to which we need to aspire in the future. It's something that we can have right now if we understand life correctly. So the possession of this eternal reality is for now. And now is in the end all that we have, this eternal now. And that's the other distinctive element in the existential experience that Schopenhauer is recommending. We can have salvation. We can have salvation immediately.
Yes.
If we have the right view, and it doesn't require some long set of historical transformations.
Yes. Yeah. No, I think that's exactly right. But again, I would note, Schopenhauer would say all of that. In the Buddhist tradition, we're not allowed to do that. So first of all, most of us will never become monks and nuns, so we're not literally renouncing the world, we're literally in the world constantly. Even for the monks and nuns, as we mentioned last week, the push is to say, if you literally retreat to a monastery and do nothing but self-discipline and try to achieve nirvana, it's selfish, which means by definition, you're going to fail because that's selfish. Actually, what you do is to have the discipline to then go back to the world and do things that lay people could not do. So set yourself on fire. Like, we couldn't do it. We're not disciplined enough. They can, but why do they do that? It's not to have an easy death, to put it mildly. It's to force oppressors to realize what it is they are doing. And note again, even you say, well, but at least at that point he's dead. No, he comes back. And so that's part of the power of rebirth. That doctrine, which again, in the secularized version, we'd have to think of some way to build that in as well. But the power of that doctrine is that that easy option is never available. So even when I die, I'm going to come back. I will have to live with all of what I've done in this life. All of you, in whatever forms you're going to be in, are sadly going to be living with all of what I've done to you in this life, and that will continue for eons. So unlike Schopenhauer, the Buddhist tradition takes out the easy option of, I will simply be tranquil and renounce. You actually can't do that unless you're the Buddha, but we're not going to become the Buddha for eons. So that's the danger of the Schopenhauerian approach, I think. Should we open it up? Yeah.
Yes, absolutely.
Open it up, please. Oh, yes, please. Sure, absolutely. So the answer is, to the first part, yes. So let me begin with a common contrast in 19th century European thought when they're discussing the will. So a plant will naturally turn toward the sun. So here's the sun, it needs light, it will naturally turn that way. It's not an act of the will because it simply does that spontaneously, and it has no power to make that decision. Humans, on the contrary, according to this theory of the will, on the contrary, can. So we can choose to move toward the sun. We can choose not to. And that begins with, as you said, the most mundane things we do. So we'll move around in a chair to make ourselves comfortable, something that a plant or mud cannot do. We're capable of that. So we're capable of minimal acts of altering the world around us for ourselves. However, we are equally, for the same reason, capable of using that same capacity of the will to radically transform ourselves and the world around us. And in much of 19th century thought, the vision is the more we do that, the more like God we become, because God, in the Christian sense, is a figure who creates the world out of an act of will, and the more we can transform the world, it's an act of will on ourselves. So the big push of Kant to some extent, but very explicitly Hegel, is to say, yes, we should fully use the will to radically assert ourselves and change the world. Hegel will try to work that in terms of a grand cosmic claim. Other 19th century figures will move it explicitly to the individual will. But all of it is in terms of, getting back to the heart of your question, the assertion of our attempts to alter ourselves and the world around us for whatever reason. I say for whatever reason because, and your examples here beautifully bring this out, the critique of all of what I've just said, that you see in Schopenhauer and we've seen articulated earlier in Buddhism as well, is to say how much of that assertion of the will is simply playing out our base desires. And the degree to which it's playing out our base desires is the degree to which we, thinking this is a radical act of self-assertion, is simply a gross playing out of our desires. And if that is the case, the goal should be, from this point of view, this counterpoint of view, break the will as self-assertion, renounce the illusory world that's been created by that act of self-assertion, and come to see what the world really is in terms of what we have created through these acts of self-assertion. But, getting back to your question, both of those views would say, think of the will as an act of radical self-assertion, either for good or for ill.
So I think one definition of the will is that the will is action motivated by the desire that the world should be different from what it is. And some of the ancient Buddhist thinkers, philosophers, defined nirvana as not desiring that anything should be different from what it is. So that's a conception, but it's a conception which was then contested within the history of Buddhism itself. But it is responsive to this question of how we should understand the conception of the will in Schopenhauer.
Definitely. The one thing I will say, though, is yes, but of course it's not saying we shouldn't try to transform the world as it currently is, because of course the push of Buddhism is to say the world as it currently is a construct of our acts of the will that have created this incredible suffering in ways that we don't recognize. So you are trying to break that. So you are trying to change the world that currently exists.
Yes, what you're trying to change is the existence in the world of these agents who mistake their true character by willing. So that's what you're canceling out in Schopenhauer. None of this applies to Buddhism.
I agree. I think that's exactly what Schopenhauer said. Exactly. Yes, please.
I have two small questions about the Schopenhauer. One is just, it seems more influenced by Taoism than Buddhism in the sense that there's this idea of this sort of massive, force of will that affects everyone universally. I'm just wondering if that seems valid at all. And then also I'm just wondering how he would respond to the critiques that the result of his philosophy is simply a sort of selfish abdication of one's responsibility to the others around them. It seems like a pretty obvious critique, and I'm just wondering how he justifies that.
Sure. Yes, well, let me take the first, and then I'll give the second to you unless you'd like me to take it too. But to begin with the first, it's unclear if Schopenhauer ever read Taoism, so I honestly don't know. That being said, I agree with the spirit of your question. So Schopenhauer will claim he's close to Buddhism, and in places is when he picks up terms like suffering, etc., which he does quite explicitly. That being said, I really think what he's closer to, much closer to, and he knows this, I mean, in terms of his quotations, if you look at what he's quoting when, correctly so, he's really much closer to the Upanishads. And the reason I say that is the Upanishads is committed to the kind of metaphysical position that he's giving a variation of. So very, very quickly, the Upanishads' argument is all humans have, if we can truly look within, an eternal true self. That eternal true self is Atman, but that eternal true self is one with the entire cosmos, which is Brahman. And Atman is Brahman, so the eternal true self is connected to the true world that really exists, and our work consists of looking within, finding that eternal self, but that finding of the eternal self is not an act of individuation. On the contrary, it is a recognition of our oneness with absolutely everything. That, of course, is basically what Schopenhauer is saying. So when Schopenhauer uses this very intriguing reworking of the notion of the will in his critique of figures like Hegel, that's what he's saying. So we, when we look within, innocently think what we see is the individual will of self-assertion, but what really is going on is that will is actually the will of the world, but it's only one of radical self-assertion because it's become individuated, which is what we're trying to break. And once you break it, you become connected with everything. And what the will really is, if we truly could understand it, is not individuated, and it is simply absolute pure oneness. So that is his position, and I agree there are many Taoist texts that could be seen as saying something similar. I don't think he just, based on what little had been translated in early 19th century Europe, I don't think he knew of Taoism. But I agree, it's really the Upanishads that he's using to critique notions of the will of his day. He picks up some notions of suffering from Buddhism, but I don't think it's a tradition he really knows that much about, to be perfectly honest. Yeah.
So, and I don't think it would be either accurate or fair to characterize Schopenhauer's moral philosophy as a philosophy of selfishness. As a young man, he wrote an essay in an attempt to win a prize, answering the question, what is the foundation of morals? And his answer to this question is, the ultimate foundation of morals is that we're all the same, that there's no basis for individual distinction. And so universal altruism and universal selfishness are the same thing. It's not that the individual distinct self is trying to grab more for himself. It's that he has transcended this illusion of individual selfhood and acts as if he were part of this universal reality in which the individual self has already been dissolved. And that's why I spoke about this impersonal benevolence.
So yeah, I think there's a great similarity in the basic idea. The big difference I would put is you lose that tension in Schopenhauer of the fact that we can't achieve this, or couldn't achieve it for so many eons, that it means in terms of this lifetime and the many, many to come for millennia, your focus can never be a simple renunciation. Now, is it still, in Buddhism, an act of compassion? Absolutely. But there's a big difference between an act of compassion that will involve, as Professor Ungers correctly said for Schopenhauer, a sense of just tranquility. The world is one of violence and suffering, and I will be tranquil and not be involved in it. Buddhism takes out that possibility because we're never going to get there, or maybe someday we will, but so many millennia away that our constant focus is to the degree to which we can work against our selfish desires is the degree to which we should be trying to act compassionately to those around us to ease suffering. And I don't want to say that's absent in Schopenhauer. Schopenhauer was at times politically involved, but pretty minimally so. I mean, I do think the ethics of Schopenhauer, exactly as Professor Unger said, really is one of tranquility and saying, don't try to strive because we can't really make a difference, and any act of striving is an individual act of the will that is only in the long run going to be self-destructive, which again is something the Buddhist tradition explicitly takes out as a possibility for us. And that I think is the key difference. The actual terms seem very similar, even the ways they're described seem very similar, but what it means for us in this world while we're alive in this life actually has dramatically different implications.
So it's worth elaborating this point from the standpoint of the relation of the individual to himself,
Yes.
right? So we think in the dominant tradition in the West, and this will be the object of our discussion yesterday, that one of the contradictions underlying selfhood is that we do have to form a coherent way of being, which we sometimes call the character. But we have to prevent this coherent way of being from becoming a carapace, a shell, a mummy that crystallizes around us and sucks the life from us. So we have a contradictory requirement, which is to form a coherent way of being, but at the same time to be able to disrupt it from within. And there are a series of practical questions. How do we disrupt it? Because it seems that we can't disrupt it simply by an act of will. So, but the will has a role. And the role of the will is to place us in situations of heightened vulnerability in which we are not in control. And then the shell is taken away from us. It's ripped off. The coat of armor, the shield, is pulled away. That's the role of the will, according to this other view. And so it's a different conception in which we have to overcome the excesses of individual selfhood, but it takes a lot of work. And this work is a significant aspect of our moral agenda, of our self-reinvention. That's another idea. Yes. And of course, it contradicts this conception of Schopenhauer's.
Yes, please.
One of the way I understand you say that one of the main antidotes by which Buddhism is prevented from falling into this sort of laziness that is present in Schopenhauer's philosophy is this idea that the nirvana is eons away in the future. But I just want to make a little note that in earlier Buddhist texts and also in the Theravada tradition, which is more conservative, this idea of nirvana being such a almost unattainable goal is not so present. In the earliest Buddhist texts, you already have many people already becoming arahants, already becoming enlightened within their own lifetime. So this idea of nirvana becoming something that requires you to become the bodhisattva and having to reincarnate during millions of years, it's something that happens much later in the history of Buddhism. So would you characterize early Buddhism as having some of these problems that are present in Schopenhauer's philosophy?
The answer to the last part of the question actually would be intriguingly no, but that's an agreement with the first part. And I'd say it's not even, to underline your point, that it really is a shift in the history of Buddhism. You see this throughout. So the main push of Buddhism is the way I was describing it. But absolutely, you see other views, and let me just give an even more extreme example. So in some forms of the Chinese Buddhist tradition, you will have a very strong claim of what is called sudden enlightenment, which the view is that you can become enlightened, and it doesn't take eons and eons and eons. So immediately raises the question, well, wouldn't that fall into the danger of a Schopenhauer? Intriguingly not, and this isn't helpful for us philosophically, because one of the questions I was asking is, could we build in this tension even without necessarily agreeing with this notion of eons and eons of rebirth? Well, what you get in sudden enlightenment is precisely the tension playing out, but in a very different way. So in notions of sudden enlightenment, the claim of nirvana with remainder, so in other traditions of Buddhism, as I mentioned, the Buddha, when he achieves nirvana, still has a body because he has achieved nirvana, but with remainder, which is the remainder of his previous karmic actions, so he still has the body and is still active in the world. So the notion of a sudden enlightenment is not that suddenly what we would call the person is suddenly gone. Actually, the notion is that person becomes a sage and with a body, and in this life can do unbelievable acts of compassion, the equivalents of setting oneself on fire, for example, as a political protest without eons and eons of work. Now, the reason I put it that way is it seems to me the way sudden enlightenment works out does maintain that tension. Because yes, it is sudden. It's taking out the claim of endless rebirths of work to get it. And yet, precisely because it also removes this other notion that eventually nirvana without remainder, it means once you've achieved sudden enlightenment, you absolutely are in this world, active in the world, striving to sense the suffering around you and acting against it. So even there's not a tradition, even within sudden enlightenment movements, of claiming tranquility, renouncing the world in an easy sense of saying we won't be involved. Actually, the argument is you have to be intensely involved because you can. So it shows, it's a wonderful question, it shows it is possible to maintain this tension in a way that I think Schopenhauer really doesn't without committing yourself to a notion of endless rebirth. Yes.
So, but there is a problem in any moral or religious view that puts salvation only in the future. So the only thing we have in human existence is now. The future doesn't count in comparison. So there always has to be some way of anticipating the future and possessing salvation now. Schopenhauer has one form of it, but every moral and religious idea will have to have some form of it, as Christianity does. You know, in Macbeth, in Shakespeare's play, the witches say to Macbeth, "You shall be king hereafter." And what does the hereafter mean? You know what it means? It means never. That's what it means. You will never be king. You will be king hereafter. It's only now that counts. And so this is a fundamental tension in all of these views that we will be exploring.
Yes, please.
If you look at how Gandhi approached nonviolence in addressing the British soldiers, and you ask yourself, is that something that's basically
step out, so I will answer and we'll get Roberto's answer too, and he can return. So wonderful question, and let me begin by just underlining your point. Absolutely, Martin Luther King takes his actions of nonviolence directly from Gandhi, and I at least would read him as, again, a secularized, I mean, Martin Luther King was obviously not secular, he was very, very Christian, but I mean a secularized version of Buddhism in the specific sense that he's not committed to all the views we've been discussing in Buddhism. He is a very, very committed Christian. But what I think Martin Luther King is trying to do is, within a Christian context, gain that same kind of power of what Gandhi was doing. And I think your way of describing it captures it perfectly. So Martin Luther King's move is to say, we're aiming at the precise same sort of two-directional approach that Gandhi would develop. On the one hand, to force white America to realize that it has created a horribly apartheid state that utterly pushes against the values it claims it cherishes. So Martin Luther King would constantly make references to the claim that all men are created equal, according to Thomas Jefferson, re-articulated by famously Lincoln, and saying, white America, realize this is not the world you have created. And then all of these actions are aimed at forcing that realization. And precisely as you said, the way of doing it, exactly as Gandhi was doing too, is to say, And therefore, those who are doing the protests must undergo incredible discipline, because for him, it has to be a nonviolent act. Because if it's simply a violent response to a violent society, you in the long run can only, or at least the danger is, you'll just end up recapitulating in some other form. And so his move is to say, we must be incredibly nonviolent and literally do what Gandhi was calling on his followers to do, like sit, for example, in a stool where you're not allowed to sit in the South and be beaten for hours and doing nothing. You just have to sit there looking straight ahead. And they would actually have training sessions where you would do this, and they would beat each other to like train yourself to steer straight ahead, don't fight back, do nothing, precisely because only by doing that do you force white America to realize what it is, what the social world they've created really is. So finally, to get back to the heart of your question, it seems to me that Martin Luther King found an incredibly successful way to build upon exactly what Gandhi was doing, using a lot of the terms from Christianity. He was a very, very devout Christian, and doing so in a way that brought out the power of exactly what Gandhi was doing. And I mean, that's an amazing example in so many ways, but in terms of what we are trying to do in this class, it's a powerful way of showing one does not need to be a Christian or a Buddhist to gain the power of these ideas and put them into play in the world. It's a wonderful question, thank you. I suspect both Gandhi and Martin Luther King would say it's the second part is, if not the main part, at least a crucial part of it, that it will never work unless that second part is an inherent part of the movement from the very beginning. Which is why both, I mean, Gandhi very famously for many years at a time, but Martin Luther King would do the same, would stop the movement at certain times saying, we're not yet ready. And that was the key. It's like, we're not ready if we're not going to be able to create a better world if we succeed. And so underlying this is the view that it is not simply that we must violently respond to our oppressors. We need to force them to realize what they are doing, and in a way that will bring about a better world by the way we act in this protest. Yes. So thank you. Perfect question. Yes, please.
I know there's been some work connecting Buddhism to Stoicism, and I was just wondering how you all see the relation between Schopenhauer's philosophy and Stoicism, and whether that's related to or a part of the secularization.
Yeah, a great question. So I actually think Schopenhauer is very close to Stoicism, and in many ways more so than, frankly, he is to Buddhism. And exactly as you said, Stoicism falls into what Schopenhauer is pushing, for better or for worse, but I think there are dangers in it. That part of what Stoicism is doing is teaching us to be tranquil in a world of endless suffering. And the more we can be tranquil, the more we are training ourselves not to be bothered by it. And
so the moral,
yes.
the moral color, the moral affect is similar, but the metaphysical foundation is
Precisely.
different.
Yes.
So the moral color is the idea of retreating into a citadel, into a fortress, but it has a different metaphysical basis. Yep. And that just goes to show that there are these alternative metaphysical foundations for reaching a convergent moral result if you judge it by its psychological reality rather than by these theoretical premises.
Yeah, and conversely, to make the same point the other way, that similar metaphysics can actually lead to very, very different ethics in the world.
Yes.
Precisely, yes. Yes, please.
In relation to what?
Collective will versus individual will, or in relation to something like sovereignty
Well, I think there's a huge distance of Schopenhauer from these realities, from these political realities. There's no developed politics in Schopenhauer, right? So I don't know what one would say about that. So take the idea of the nation. So it's interesting. This will be a subject of discussion later in the semester for us. So the nations of the world used to be, for the most part, like tribes, organized on the basis of similarity, of consanguinity and similarity of experience and of vision. And now the nations of the world are in the process of becoming something else, experiments in different ways of being human. And in that road, from being tribes to being these experiments in ways of being human, an accident has taken place. And let me try and describe what it is. So the accident is that they now all compete against one another, not just materially, economically, and militarily, but in ideological seduction. So in order to succeed in this worldwide rivalry, they have to tear away parts of themselves and assimilate something that worked in some other part of the world and combine it with a previous part. So for the ancient Romans, to be a Roman meant to live according to the customs of the ancient Romans. But now these collective identities are being eviscerated under the pressure of this worldwide competition. So for example, the Meiji Restoration in Japan in the middle of the 19th century. The Japanese come to the altar, and in order to remain independent, they have to become less Japanese than they were before. They have to import some foreign practices and combine them with what they were like before. So there's a progressive evisceration of the concrete collective identities in order to maintain this will to be different. So then the following situation arises in the world, which helps us identify the distinctive and uniquely poisonous character of contemporary nationalism. Two nations live side by side, and they hate each other, not because they're different, but because they're becoming alike, and they want to be different. So there's this rage, the impotent will to be different. Actual difference, defined by customs, is always porous and subject to compromise. But the will to difference can only be the object of an intransigent faith. It's not capable of compromise. Now, faced with this then, there are two possible responses that we see in the world. One is the response of liberal cosmopolitanism. Suppress the will to difference. We should all converge. And the other is the response of regressive nationalism. Preserve inherited difference. But there's a third response, which I would recommend as a radical Democrat, which is equip the will to difference. That is, give the nations of the world the institutions that will allow them to develop new difference, so that there will be this dialectic of differences in the world. Difference is not the problem. Difference is the solution. And the will to difference is dangerous insofar as it is empty, and ceases to be dangerous when it is fertile. That's what I would say. But all of that presupposes the importance of the real differences of the world, and it's that's denied in Schopenhauer, because Schopenhauer is saying, get out of that. Get out of those entanglements, out of those peculiarities, those distinctions. The road to salvation is this universal road in which we have the eternal now and in which we stand above the entanglements. And I would say the opposite, that salvation lies only in the entanglements, that there's no circumvention of them. And then your example about nationalism presents a unique problem for which we have to develop the ideas. Yes, back there? Oh.
Oh, please, yes.
I have three. I want to go back to Schopenhauer's three solutions that you have outlined because all three seem to me to fail, even on his account of how they can deal with the will and the problem, right? I think the first approach, which is something like salvation through ecstatic contemplation, seems to fail because there is an implicit presupposition that there is something to be gained from this more ontologically pure experience of the will, right? That is to say, the veil of Midas stripped off, and what we are experiencing is this sheer individuated formation of that primordial ocean, right? So it's not clear to me that anyone who is fond of doing music cannot be torn asunder by passions and then just be doing that as a little contemplative aside, right? So its curing or therapeutic potential is not clear, right? And the constant exposure to this devastating result of the will, right, is still there. The second proposal, aestheticism of life. If colony is the blind spot of modernity, what's the idea of don't colonize the world, colonize yourself, die in this life, and then just diffuse the energy of self-determination and bring it to a standstill? And we could have a Hegelian critique of the third direction, where sainthood could be simply seen as the will to feel better because of one's feeling embarrassed by being attached to the world of sensory particulars. You want to be connected to the absolute, you feel guilty, therefore you mortify the flesh. So the problem is still there.
I think it all goes back, Sasha, to the Wordsworth text I read at the beginning. So there's this fire, this energy in humanity. Can we disregard it or suppress it? And it seems to me that what you're saying, in effect, is that we can't suppress it. And that if we suppress it, it will reappear in perverse forms, but it will not be denied. So, for example, take Schopenhauer's attitude to music. So, music is supposedly the disinterested way of looking at the world. But one could have another idea. What do we have in music? We have the experience of being able to feel and to want more than we can say and think. So this isn't a denial of the will. It's the opposite. It's that our striving, our sensibility are greater than our cognitive powers, and it overreaches. That's what it is. So I think it's a misrepresentation of the meaning of music. And we could have this systematic critique of each of the aspects of Schopenhauer's attempt to deny the life force within humanity.
full agreement, both Sasha with your points and with Professor Unger's response. And just to underline both, I mean, this has been implicit throughout a lot of what we've been saying, but let's make it explicit. Note, when Schopenhauer picks up the Buddhist term suffering, which is one of the few places where he is actually quoting from Buddhist materials, note exactly, as Sasha's mentioned in his comment and Professor Unger has underlined in his response as well, this is exclusively my suffering, right? It's I am suffering, and if I can make myself tranquil, I will be less bothered. And I agree. I think the idea that listening to music, et cetera, is a way to become tranquil and ease one's suffering is absurd. I also would note this striking shift from what we were discussing in the Buddhist tradition. In the Buddhist tradition, when they discuss suffering, it's I am constructing a world through my actions, an illusory world because I think I'm living in one world that I'm really not living in. That world is inherently creating incredible levels of suffering that, again, will have ramifications for eons and eons of rebirths of all living creatures. And the emphasis of that is to constantly get you to say, note the degree to which my illusory world is creating this suffering. How do I see it? How do I break that? And how do I start working against all of the suffering that everyone else is equally creating? All of that is gone in Schopenhauer. It's literally his suffering. It's Arthur is suffering. and if he can listen to music, he can be tranquil. And I think, number one, poor Arthur, I suspect, was not successful in becoming tranquil. But even if he had been, from a Buddhist perspective, that would be pure selfishness. I mean, even if that worked, it would be pure selfishness and would do nothing to ease suffering in a more generalized sense. Yes, please.
Yeah, before the class ends, I just wanted if you could make some comments on today's situation in Ukraine in
Yes.
light of, not for the sake of political and social analysis of a very foreign country, at least very distant from us in the West, but for the sake of the philosophical question that we're trying to answer here, which is how to live our lives.
Yes.
So it seems, in a very personal view, I think the whole role of philosophy and the social impact of philosophy is precisely to change our views of the world in order to, or define our views of the world in order to seek some peace in our common understandings and differences. So I don't know, in light of the question that we're trying to answer, how would you analyze what's happening today? Because the text, it's also interesting because we started with the text written by a poet that, in that context, historical, seems a long time ago, was a context of war. And today, we're in a potential context also. So we can have today a poet that can actually write about today's situation that could inspire future and present philosophical dialogue.
Well, before the class started, I told Michael, so commenting on these events, I said, well, the 19th century has already come back.
Exactly.
Now let's see whether the 20th century comes back.
Yes.
So this is terrible, right? Because this is the push,
Exactly.
the atavistic push of humanity to the past. And how do we fix it? We don't fix it by denying its reality, by escaping to this evanescent world of the timeless one. We fix it by confronting its particularity and trying to give a more constructive shape, a more fertile result to these forces, so that history doesn't keep just returning in its earlier form, but progresses. That's the task. And I think in our discussions here, I always would want to emphasize both the connection and the distinction between the moral and the political. So here our focus is on the future of the moral agenda. not the political. And other inquiries we're dealing with the political. They're always connected. But the fundamental difference, which I've stated before, is that our political projects happen in historical time. And our moral projects advance or fail in biographical time, in the space of a human life. And one of the consequences of this is that our moral ideas have to somehow make up for the failures of our political projects. So until the political projects have advanced more, what do we do now? That's the problem that arises in morals. And how do we anticipate in our relations to other people the world that we have failed to construct politically? So there's this dialectical relation between the moral and the political. And if we don't struggle for that, then there will be this recrudescence of the primitive. And the past will keep coming back and pulling us down, like this business of the 19th century and then the 20th century. I didn't follow the question. I didn't hear the question. What was the question?
Why is aesthetic ideal such a central theme in religion?
Ascetic? Did you say ascetic? Uh-huh. Is it? I don't know. Asceticism is one theme in the history of religion, but there are many contrary themes. I don't think asceticism is a big deal in Christianity. Schopenhauer makes a big deal of it because he wants to mortify and destroy the will. But do you have a view on that, Michael?
Yeah, I mean, very much along the same lines. So let me begin by agreeing with your point that asceticism is part of attempts that you see across many religions to, as you said, reject the will, and specifically reject the will as being a product of human desire, and your goal is to tame, if not fully conquer, the desires, and therefore cease the things we do in the world that are so destructive. In terms of the second part of your question, do you find oppositions to this view? Let me begin with the example you mentioned, because it'll become, of course, important for our class too. So you're absolutely right. So one of Nietzsche's explicit moves here is to say he wants to take the notion of the will and the notion of self-assertion and radicalize it. And for him, this means an overturning of Christianity, an overturning of Christianity coming from that side of Christianity that
But then
emphasizes-
seeing Christianity as on the side of asceticism.
Precisely,
As against the life force. I don't think that's the Christian view. I think so to discuss the problem of asceticism in a Christian idiom, one has to have a broader set of ideas. For example, one would say, why do we accumulate things? If you take, for example, the early modern English novel, everyone is accumulating things. Robinson Crusoe on his island is accumulating things. The accumulation of things is the principle of the imagination. We accumulate things so as not to depend on people. That's why we accumulate things. And the significance of material accumulation is that it's an alternative to dependence on the others. That's why it's unacceptable. So it's the substitution of our material enrichment for the density of our personal encounters. That's why it's sinful. That's I think would be a much more legitimate version of the Christian ascetic ideal. It wouldn't be some conception of the mortification of the flesh. It would be the superiority of interpersonal encounter to material accumulation. And then it becomes much more interesting because it has a whole range of material consequences. So where do we put our faith? What do we believe in? What matters? What is precious? What's really precious are the others. And all this material stuff is entirely secondary. That's what we should believe. Huh? And so you could say that's a version of asceticism, but it's a completely different version. And the emphasis is not on mortification.
And let me just also, building on this mention, also looking forward to where we'll be going in the class, when we move into some of the Chinese traditions, Confucianism and Taoism, there's no ascetic traditions that are very strong at all. And in fact, that becomes one of the big debates when Buddhism enters China, that both Confucians and Taoists will criticize Buddhists for, and saying, no, even the act of renouncing the world enough to do the disciplinary work to return to the world and act within it that we've been discussing, both Confucians and Taoists will say, no, but even that should not be occurring. It should all be within this world, and then a question of refining and cultivating in this world, but it will push against the ascetic traditions of things like Buddhism. Yes. So we'll come back to your questions as we get into this material, because it is a very fascinating issue. When and why do religions push an ascetic tradition, and when and why do they strongly oppose such traditions? Yes. Yes, in the back, please.
So I was thinking about something that Professor Unger said at the beginning or earlier in the class. It's possible that I didn't really appropriately understand what was said, but it was something like there being a possibility of salvation in the now. And it made me think about something that a Dharma teacher once said to me about it was a Zen teacher. He said that Buddhism is not about salvation, but about liberation. And I was wondering if we could go back for some pursuant to what you were saying, your example of the case of the monk self-immolating as an act of protest. And it seems to me like there's a double negative kind of, like sort of like the will to break the will is another type of will or something. So I was wondering if you could say something about that, and specifically in that instance, how this collective will, like let's say as an opposition to war, kind of how that presents itself in that case, like a self-immolating monk in protest.
And then after you say something, Michael, I want to make a suggestion to the class, but it's about another topic. So I don't know whether you want to answer this first quickly.
So yeah, I'll be very brief, so we'll have time to get to this. But yes, wonderful question. And the key for the self-immolating monk is, and it touches on exactly your point, it only works if it works in terms of how it affects others. And so the self-immolating monk is not a monk who's trying to commit suicide. The self-immolating monk is a monk who's doing it as an act of protest, which, if it is successful, will affect those seeing it and force a change to ease suffering around. And so it's all about trying to, that's a radical example, but it's the same sort of work you're learning to do at a mundane level, just with daily interactions. You're trying to sense the degree to which suffering is being created through interactions, often things we're doing that we're failing to realize. And the more you can realize that, how you can begin to act to shift that. And the self-immolating monk is simply an incredible radicalization of that same move. Doing something to obviously we could not do without that kind of discipline. But if it works at that level. It would work because it would force a shift in sets of processes going on in the world that would allow for a change. And that's the focus on whether it would be judged a success or not, as opposed to the personal act of the monk himself. So yeah, thank you.
So I have a practical suggestion to make to the class, and it doesn't regard any of the issues that we were talking about today. So, but it is brought to mind by dealing with Schopenhauer. For me, it's brought to mind because Schopenhauer, as I said, is the opposite of what I believe in. The most common defect in the education of educated people now in the contemporary world is an inadequate acquaintance with the history of philosophy. The history of philosophy is the history of the fundamental ideas in our civilization and in all civilizations, the great thinkers. And this is a defect that can be readily remedied. So I have a suggestion. The first suggestion is to read one of the histories of philosophy. And the one that I would most recommend is the one by Frederick Coplestone in 9 volumes, available in paperback. No, you're laughing because you think it's a big project, but it's actually something you could do over a summer. You could read the 9 paperback volumes of Coplestone's History of Western Philosophy easily in a summer. The reason why I recommend Coplestone is, unlike many of the other histories of philosophy, it's not opinionated. It is a straightforward account of the doctrines of the philosophies, of the philosophers, by this aristocratic English Jesuit. You know, professors always have a prejudice against secondary works. It's a kind of intellectual snobbery. It doesn't make any sense at all. It makes sense to read one of these histories of philosophy. The second thing you should do then is to select 1 or 2 thinkers and read everything the person ever wrote. And form your mind then in tension, in dialogue with this other thinker. It's not necessarily a thinker with whose ideas you sympathize. It might be the opposite. It might be like my reading Schopenhauer, because it's the opposite. So you have to be guided by intuition in the choice of this thinker. So, and I think that there's the 2 very simple means by which you can form yourselves. And this provides an antidote to the orthodoxies of the university culture. Because you know what happens is, in the university disciplines, is you have this system in which the different fields are organized on the basis of a forced marriage between method and subject matter. So, for example, evolutionary biology is studied by a historical method. Fundamental physics is studied by an anti-historical method. Why? We discovered in the 1920s that the universe has a history. So everything in it is historical. It's completely arbitrary. Economics is not the study of the economy. It's the study of a method pioneered by the marginalist theoreticians at the end of the 19th century. And any way of studying the economy that's not by that method is not considered economics, and so forth. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that all these disciplines are like crystallized versions of some hidden metaphysical program, like the philosophy of deep structure, that there's an abiding structure of basic constituents, universal laws, constants and symmetries of nature. That's a philosophical idea, undermined or discredited by the discovery of the historical character of the universe. and it animates even the major 20th century theories in fundamental physics, quantum mechanics, and relativity. So the only way you have to resist these orthodoxies and not to be in the grip of the preconceptions is to have this acquaintance with the history of philosophy. So it's an act of liberation. It has tremendous significance. And it allows you to put the university culture in its place and to begin to form your minds. Because what is education? Education is the ability to transcend the ideas of your time and of the professors and so forth. Otherwise, you're like little children in the grip of these orthodoxies. So I vehemently recommend to you that you take your education into your own hands. You understand that beyond the initial steps of education, what you can learn in courses and in school is entirely secondary. And real education is self-education. And so, what are the universities good at? The universities are good at teaching you skills, like how to read German or how to solve problems in physics. And what are they bad at? Paradoxically, they're bad at thinking. So anything that has to do with ideas, imagination, they're no good at that. And that's what you have to do for yourselves. And this is the way to do it. And it's a radical transformation of your attitude to your own education. That's what I had to recommend.